He brought his ex to our engagement party and flaunted her in front of everyone. By midnight, he was on his knees begging me not to walk away as I revealed who really owned the venue his entire career hinged on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let's dive into today's story. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who kept secrets from the person she loved. Transparency and honesty were values I prided myself on, qualities that had guided my personal life and built my business from the ground up. But sometimes, life teaches you that there's a difference between secrecy and privacy, between hiding truths and simply waiting for the right moment to reveal them. My name is Natalie, and 6 months ago, I was engaged to a man named Richard. We met at a charity fundraiser 3 years prior. He was charming, ambitious, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and ambitions. Coming from a small town where I was always just Natalie, the mechanic's daughter, finding someone who saw me as more was intoxicating. Richard worked as a marketing director for a hospitality group that managed luxury venues across the city. He loved talking about his connections, the high-profile clients he brought in, and the exclusive spaces he had access to. I would smile and listen, genuinely impressed by his passion, even if I sometimes felt he placed too much value on status and appearances. "When we get married," he would say, tracing circles on my palm, "we'll host parties people will talk about for years. I'll introduce you to everyone who matters in this city." What Richard didn't know, what I hadn't found the right moment to share, was that I wasn't just Natalie, the woman who ran a modest consulting business from a converted industrial space downtown. I was also Natalie Winters, the silent owner of Winterscape Properties, a company that had quietly acquired several historic buildings across the city, including the Meridian, one of the most sought-after event venues in the region. My grandfather had started the company with a single rundown theater he renovated himself. When he passed away 5 years ago, he left everything to me, his only grandchild who shared his passion for preserving beautiful spaces while making them profitable. I chose to remain a silent partner, letting my management team handle the public-facing aspects while I focused on strategy and acquisitions. It wasn't that I was hiding my success from Richard intentionally. At first, it simply hadn't come up. Then, as I observed his need to be the more accomplished partner in our relationship, I found myself hesitating. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, perhaps after the wedding, when our lives were fully intertwined and insecurities would matter less. "You're so supportive," he'd say, kissing my forehead after describing his latest business. Triumph. "That's what I love about you. You understand what it takes to succeed without needing the spotlight yourself." I'd smile and change the subject, ignoring the voice in my head that questioned why I couldn't be both supportive and successful. In his eyes. Our engagement came after 2 years of dating, a romantic proposal at sunset on the rooftop garden of the Meridian. Richard had been especially proud of arranging it, mentioning repeatedly how he'd called in every favor to secure the venue for our private moment. "Only the best for you," he'd said, as he slipped the diamond ring onto my finger. "I want to give you the world." I had stood there, the irony thick in the air around us, wondering if I should tell him then that he had just proposed to me on property that I owned. But something held me back. The perfect moment somehow didn't feel right. For this particular truth, planning our engagement party became Richard's obsession. He insisted on hosting it at the Meridian to bring our story full circle, he explained. I agreed, curious to see how he would interact with the venue management, who knew exactly who I was, but had been instructed to maintain my privacy. "I've arranged everything," Richard announced proudly over dinner, 2 weeks before the event. "I spoke with the venue director personally. The Meridian will be exclusively ours for the evening." "That's wonderful," I replied, taking a sip of wine to hide my smile. "You must have made quite an impression." "Well," he winked, I might have mentioned that my company could direct several high-profile corporate events their way in the coming year. I nodded, making a mental note to check with my management team about this conversation. I didn't mind Richard leveraging our engagement for a discount. I would have given one anyway. But making promises involving future business crossed a line. As the engagement party approached, Richard became increasingly preoccupied with the guest list. He wanted to invite colleagues, industry contacts, and various socialites he described as instrumental to my career trajectory. I focused on inviting my close friends, my management team, whom Richard assumed were just business associates, and my small but treasured family circle. 2 days before the party, Richard casually mentioned that he had added a few names to the guest list. Just some people from the office who would be offended if left out, he explained, scrolling through his phone while I reviewed catering arrangements. Anyone I should know about specifically? I asked, not looking up from my tablet. There was a slight pause before he answered. Well, Veronica from the creative team. She's been instrumental in the Lux Hotels campaign. I felt a slight shift in the air at the mention of her name. Richard had spoken of Veronica before, always professionally, but with an undercurrent that had occasionally made me wonder. They had dated briefly before he met me, a fact he had disclosed early in our relationship. Your ex-girlfriend, Veronica? I asked, finally looking up at him. Richard's expression remained carefully neutral. That was years ago, Natalie. She's an important colleague now. It would be awkward not to include her when the entire creative team is coming. I studied him for a moment, noting the slightly defensive set of his shoulders, the way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Of course, I said finally. It's your career, and these are your colleagues. Invite whoever you think should be there. Relief washed over his features. Exactly. It's just business, nothing more. That night, I lay awake, questioning why I felt uneasy. Was it ordinary jealousy? The kind any woman might feel about her fiancé's ex attending their engagement party? Or was it something more specific to Richard and Veronica? More troubling, why hadn't I felt comfortable enough to share my full truth with the man I was planning to marry? The morning of our engagement party arrived with a flurry of activity. Richard left early to oversee some details at the venue, leaving me to prepare at our apartment. As I slipped into my carefully chosen cream silk dress, I made a decision. Tonight would be the night I finally told Richard about Winterscape Properties and my ownership of the Meridian. After the party, when we were alone, I would open up completely about my business success and financial position. No more waiting for the perfect moment, I told my reflection, fastening a pair of sapphire earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. It's time for complete honesty. I arrived at the Meridian an hour before guests were due, expecting to find Richard reviewing arrangements with the staff. Instead, I was greeted by Elise, my venue director, looking uncharacteristically concerned. Ms. Winters, she said quietly, using my professional title despite my repeated requests to call me Natalie. There's something you should know before the other guests arrive. What is it? I asked, already sensing that my perfect evening was about to take an unexpected turn. Mr. Collins has made some adjustments to the arrangements we discussed, and he's been here for several hours with a woman from his office. They've been quite involved in redesigning aspects of the layout and decor. My stomach tightened. A woman? Do you mean Veronica? Elise nodded, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite the awkwardness of the situation. Yes. She introduced herself as the creative director of his team. They've been quite familiar with each other. I took a deep breath, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them pleasant. Where are they now? In the West Garden, finalizing the lighting arrangement. Thank you, Elise, I said, straightening my shoulders. Don't worry about me. Let's proceed as planned with the event. And please continue to maintain discretion about my ownership, at least for now. As I made my way toward the West Garden, I wasn't sure what I would find or how I would react. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The perfect moment I had been waiting for to reveal my truth might not exist, and perhaps it never had. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The west garden of the Meridian was my favorite part of the property. When I purchased the venue, this secluded space had been overgrown and neglected. I'd spent countless weekends working alongside professional landscapers to transform it into a lush, intimate retreat with stone pathways winding between flowering plants and antique copper lanterns hanging from century-old oak trees. It was a space that told my story, the perfect blend of preservation and reinvention that defined my approach to business and, I had thought, to life. As I approached, I heard laughter, Richard's deep chuckle followed by a woman's melodic response. I slowed my steps, my silk dress whispering against the stone path. The garden opened before me, and there they were. Richard standing unnecessarily close to a striking woman with copper-red hair that caught the early evening light. Her hand rested on his forearm as she pointed toward the canopy of string lights. Above them, her crimson nails stark against the dark blue of his suit jacket. For a moment, I simply observed them. There was an ease between them, a comfortable intimacy that comes from shared history. Richard's head was tilted toward her, his expression animated in a way I recognized from the early days of our relationship. They were completely absorbed in each other, unaware of my presence or the way my world was quietly tilting on its axis. The lighting is all wrong, the woman was saying. It should be softer, more romantic. This isn't a corporate event, Richard. You're absolutely right, he agreed, his tone warm with admiration. I don't know what I was thinking. You've always had the better eye for these things. That's why you called me, she replied with a confident smile. Your taste has always been. Her gaze flicked to the engagement ring on her finger, a small diamond in a vintage setting I'd chosen for its understated elegance. Developing. Richard laughed instead of defending my choice. The sound cut through me like glass. I cleared my throat, and they turned in unison, guilty surprise flickering across both their faces before Richard composed himself. Natalie, you're early, he exclaimed, stepping away from Veronica with an unconvincing casualness. I was just getting Veronica's input on the lighting. You remember Veronica, my creative director? Veronica's smile was professionally polite, her assessment of me swift and dismissive. She wore a jade green dress that enhanced her eyes and hugged every curve with practiced precision. Next to her vibrant presence, I suddenly felt colorless in my cream silk. Of course, I replied, extending my hand. How could I forget? It's nice to officially meet you, Veronica. Her handshake was firm, her skin cool against mine. Likewise, Richard speaks so highly of you. I've been helping him make sure tonight is absolutely perfect. He was concerned about some of the original arrangements. I raised an eyebrow, turning to Richard. Original arrangements? The ones we spent weeks planning together? Richard laughed nervously, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Just a few tweaks, darling. Nothing major. Veronica has experience with high-profile events like this, and I wanted to make sure everything was flawless. High-profile events like engagement parties? I asked, keeping my tone light despite the knot forming in my stomach. Well, with the guest list Richard has assembled, this is practically a networking event for half the luxury hospitality industry in the city, Veronica replied before Richard could answer. The right impression tonight could open doors for both of you. How considerate, I said, meeting her gaze directly. And what doors might those be? A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face at my direct question, but Richard interjected before she could respond. Sweetheart, why don't we check on the champagne? Service? I requested that specialty vintage you like. He placed his hand on the small of my back, attempting to guide me away from the garden and from Veronica. I stood my ground. Actually, I'd like to see these improvements you've both been working on. After all, it is our engagement party. Richard's smile tightened. Of course, Veronica was just suggesting we lower the lighting and add some candles along the pathways. More romantic, less— what did you call it originally? Subtly elegant? The implication that my taste was somehow lacking stung more than I cared to admit. I glanced around the garden, noting several additions that hadn't been in our original plan. Oversized floral arrangements and colors that clashed with the garden's natural palette. Gaudy golden lanterns that overpowered the antique copper ones I'd carefully selected, and a temporary trellis covered in fairy lights that blocked the view of the century-old stone fountain. I see, I said quietly. And the rest of the venue? Have you made improvements there as well? Just a few adjustments, Veronica replied with false modesty. The original concept was charming, but lacked the sophistication expected for an event of this caliber. I turned to face her fully. And what caliber would that be exactly? Richard stepped between us, his discomfort obvious. Natalie, can I speak with you privately for a moment? I nodded, maintaining my composure. Excuse us, Veronica. I'm sure you have more improvements to oversee. She smiled thinly. Of course. Take your time. The guests will be arriving soon, and there's still so much to do. With a familiar touch to Richard's arm that lingered a beat too long, she glided past us and disappeared down the path toward the main building. Once we were alone, Richard turned to me, his expression a mixture of annoyance and placation. Was that necessary? I could ask you the same thing, I replied. When did our engagement party become a project for your ex-girlfriend to redesign? He sighed heavily, as if I were being unreasonable. Veronica is a colleague now, Natalie. She has connections and expertise that could benefit both of us. This isn't personal. It feels personal when I arrive at my own engagement party to find you and your ex redesigning everything we planned together, without consulting me. I tried calling you several times this morning, he countered defensively. You didn't answer. I was at the salon, Richard, getting ready for our engagement party, the one we spent weeks planning together. He reached for my hands, his expression softening into the charming smile that had first drawn me to him. Darling, I know how important tonight is. That's why I wanted everything to be perfect. Veronica has contacts at Lux Magazine. They might feature the party if it's impressive enough. Think about what that could mean for us. For us? Or for you? I asked quietly. A flash of irritation crossed his face before he masked it. For both of us, of course. My career benefits you too, doesn't it? The lifestyle we enjoy, the future we're planning, it all depends on my professional success. Something cold settled in my chest as I realized how completely he believed this, that I was dependent on him, that my happiness hinged on his success, that I had nothing to offer but support and admiration. Richard, I began carefully, do you remember when we first talked about having our engagement party here at the Meridian? He nodded impatiently. Of course, it's where I proposed. It's perfect symmetry. And do you remember telling me that you'd called in every favor to book this place? That you'd had to leverage your company's relationship with the venue? His expression grew wary. What about it? I took a deep breath, preparing to finally tell him the truth, when a staff member appeared at the garden entrance. Excuse me, Mr. Collins? There's an issue with the catering that requires your attention, and the first guests have begun to arrive. Richard squeezed my hands. We'll continue this conversation later, all right? Right now, we need to be the perfect couple everyone expects us to be. Without waiting for my response, he strode away, leaving me alone in the garden that no longer felt like mine. I stood there for a moment, surrounded by gaudy decorations that had replaced my careful choices, feeling as displaced as the original copper lanterns that now sat discarded by the garden wall. As I made my way back toward the main building, I caught sight of Richard and Veronica, their heads close together as they spoke urgently to the catering manager. Richard's hand rested comfortably on the small of her back, the same gesture he'd used with me minutes earlier. Guests had indeed begun to arrive, filtering into the grand entrance hall where waiters circulated with champagne flutes. I plastered on a smile and moved to join them, the role of the perfect, supportive fiancé settling over me like an ill-fitting dress. But something had shifted irrevocably in the foundations of my relationship. The evening stretched before me, hours of pretense ahead while a decision crystallized in my mind. Tonight was indeed the night for truth, but perhaps not in the gentle, private moment I had planned. Some revelations, I was beginning to understand, demanded a grander stage. I found myself in the powder room of the Meridian's East Wing, a space few guests ever discovered. During renovations, I'd insisted on preserving the original Art Deco vanity and emerald-tiled walls, while adding modern touches like the vintage-inspired sconces that cast a warm, flattering glow. This hidden gem was my personal retreat within the venue, a place where I could escape the demands of being both owner and client. Now, it served as sanctuary from the growing spectacle of my own engagement party. The woman in the mirror looked composed despite the turmoil beneath her surface. My cream silk dress caught the light beautifully, my grandmother's sapphire earrings adding a touch of inherited elegance. I looked like exactly what Richard wanted, a tasteful, supportive partner who complemented his ambitions without overshadowing them. "Is this really who you are?" I whispered to my reflection. For 3 years, I'd allowed Richard to believe I was a modestly successful small business owner who marveled at his connections and accomplishments. I'd downplayed my own achievements, never correcting his assumptions about my financial situation or business acumen. I told myself it was modesty, not deception, that I was waiting for the right moment, not hiding a fundamental part of myself. But watching him with Veronica had forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I wasn't protecting Richard's ego. I was protecting a relationship built on a foundation that couldn't support the weight of my full self. I recalled the conversations where Richard had casually dismissed my business insights with patronizing smiles. The times he'd explained basic concepts I'd mastered years ago. The subtle ways he redirected conversations whenever I demonstrated knowledge that rivaled or surpassed his own. "You're so cute when you talk business," he'd say, kissing my forehead as if I were a child playing at adult concerns. I had laughed it off, telling myself it didn't matter as long as we loved each other. But love without respect wasn't love at all. It was an arrangement where one person remained permanently diminished so the other could feel perpetually superior. The weight of this realization settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. I'd compromised myself in ways I'd never acknowledged, small surrenders accumulating into a life where I walked on eggshells around my own success. A knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. "Natalie, are you in there?" It was Emma, my closest friend and the operations manager for Winterscape Properties. Unlike the rest of my team, who maintained the fiction of being mere acquaintances around Richard, Emma had been introduced as my college roommate. I opened the door to find her looking concerned, her sleek black pantsuit a stark contrast to the pastels and jewel tones favored by most of the female guests. "I've been looking everywhere for you," she said, slipping inside and closing the door. "What's going on? Half the venue looks like it was decorated by someone with a gold foil addiction, and your fiancé is out there introducing his ex-girlfriend to everyone as his creative partner. And why is Gordon Matthews from Lux magazine here taking photographs?" I sank onto the velvet bench beneath the window. Apparently, Richard and Veronica have been improving our engagement party, without consulting me. Emma's eyebrows shot up. "And you didn't shut that down immediately? You, the woman who once fired a contractor for changing a doorknob design without approval?" A laugh escaped me despite everything. "I know. I'm still trying to figure out how we got here." Emma sat beside me, her expression softening. "Nat, I've kept quiet about this for a long time because you seemed happy. But this isn't you. The woman I know would never let someone else dictate the terms of her life, especially not in her own building. That's the problem, isn't it? I said quietly. He doesn't know it's my building. He doesn't really know me at all. Because you haven't let him, Emma pointed out gently. The truth of her words stung. I thought I was being considerate. His pride is so wrapped up in his professional image, in being the provider, the successful one. And that's exactly the problem, Emma replied, her tone firmer now. A man who needs you to be less so he can feel like more isn't looking for a partner. He's looking for an accessory. I stared at her, the blunt assessment landing with the force of undeniable truth. But it's not just him, I admitted, voicing the thought that had been circling in my mind. I've been complicit in this. I chose to hide parts of myself instead of demanding a relationship where I could be fully seen and valued. Emma nodded. The question is, what are you going to do? About it now? Outside the powder room, I could hear the party gaining momentum, laughter, music, the clinking of glasses, an event celebrating a union that, I now understood, had been built on carefully maintained illusions. I don't know, I said honestly. Confronting him here in front of everyone seems petty. It's not petty to stand up for yourself, Emma countered. Besides, from what I've seen out there, Richard doesn't seem concerned about embarrassing you. What do you mean? Emma hesitated, then pulled out her phone and scrolled through a few images before handing it to me. I took these about 10 minutes ago. The photos showed Richard and Veronica standing close together near the champagne fountain. In one image, his hand rested intimately on her waist as they laughed together. In another, she was straightening his tie, their faces, mere inches apart. The final photo caught them in what appeared to be a private toast, their glasses touching as they gazed at each other with unmistakable intimacy. They're not even trying to be discreet, Emma said quietly, and people are noticing. A curious calm settled over me as I handed the phone back. Not the numb shock of betrayal, but the crystalline clarity that comes with perfect understanding. The pieces of the puzzle that had been Richard and Veronica's professional relationship clicked into place. The late meetings, the weekend team-building retreats, the texts that made him smile in a way my messages never did. You know what's ironic? I said, rising to my feet and smoothing my dress. I was planning to tell him everything tonight, about Winterscape, about owning the Meridian. I thought once we were married, my success wouldn't threaten him anymore. Emma stood as well, studying my face. And now? Now I realize I've been asking the wrong question all along, I replied, meeting my own gaze in the mirror one last time. It's not about when the right time would be to tell Richard the truth. It's about why I ever thought I needed to hide it in the first place. The woman reflected back at me was no longer uncertain. Her eyes were clear, her posture straight, her purpose defined. This was the woman who had built Winterscape Properties from her grandfather's legacy. The woman who made decisions worth millions without flinching. The woman who had, somehow, allowed herself to be diminished in the name of love, or what she had mistaken for love. What are you going to do? Emma asked, recognizing the shift in my demeanor. I touched my grandmother's sapphire earrings for courage, thinking of the strong woman who had worn them before me. A woman who had never compromised her worth for anyone. I'm going to take back my engagement party, I said simply. And my life. Emma grinned, a flash of fierce pride in her eyes. It's about time. Want backup? I shook my head, already moving toward the door. No, this is something I need to do myself. As I stepped back into the hallway, the sounds of celebration washed over me, my guests enjoying a party that no longer represented the future I wanted. The path ahead was uncertain, likely painful, undoubtedly public. But for the first time in years, it felt authentically mine. I made my way through the crowd, nodding and smiling at familiar faces, my mind crystallizing around a single clarifying thought. I had spent 3 years making myself smaller to fit into Richard's world. Tonight, he would finally see the true dimensions of mine. As I moved through the crowd, I felt a strange sense of seeing the meridian through new eyes. The venue that had once been my proudest achievement now felt like contested territory, marked by garish decorations that clashed with the building's historic character. Giant arrangements of gold-sprayed roses dominated tables meant for conversation. Ostentatious ice sculptures sweated onto antique hardwood floors. Servers I didn't recognize carried trays of canapés that weren't on our agreed menu. My engagement party had been transformed into a networking event for Richard's benefit, with little trace of my input or preferences remaining. Near the grand staircase, I spotted Richard's mother, Catherine, holding court among her friends. She'd never approved of me, viewing my middle-class background and little business as signs I wasn't suitable for her son. Now she was gesturing animatedly toward Veronica, who stood nearby with Richard. "Doesn't she just bring a touch of class to the whole affair?" Catherine was saying, loud enough to carry. "Such an eye for elegance." I paused, watching as Veronica accepted the compliment with practiced modesty, while Richard beamed beside her. They looked like a power couple, perfectly matched in ambition and style, comfortable in the spotlight they clearly both craved. For a moment, doubt crept back in. Would confronting them just confirm Catherine's opinion that I wasn't sophisticated enough for her son's world? Would I come across as the jealous, insecure fiancé making a scene at her own engagement party? Then I remembered Emma's words. "It's not petty to stand up for yourself." I straightened my shoulders and approached the group, a polite smile fixed on my face. "Catherine, I'm so glad you could make it," I said, embracing my future mother-in-law briefly. Her perfume was overwhelming, her return hug perfunctory. "Natalie, there you are. We were just discussing the lovely improvements to the venue," Catherine replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Veronica has such vision. She's completely transformed the space." "Indeed she has," I agreed pleasantly. "It's almost unrecognizable." Richard stepped forward, placing his arm around my waist in a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. "Darling, the Gordon Matthews from Lux magazine is here. He's considering featuring the party in their society pages. Isn't that fantastic?" "Imagine the exposure," Veronica added, sipping champagne from a flute that bore the Winterscape Properties insignia, a detail she couldn't possibly appreciate. "The right kind of publicity can open so many doors." I met her gaze directly. "And which doors are you hoping to open, Veronica?" A brief silence fell over the group, my directness disrupting their carefully maintained veneer of polite conversation. Richard's arm tightened around me in warning. Veronica recovered quickly, her smile sharpening. "Professional ones, of course. Richard and I have been discussing a potential joint venture for high-end event planning. Tonight is something of a proof of concept." "A joint venture?" I repeated, looking at Richard. "How interesting. You never mentioned that to me." Richard laughed a bit too loudly. "It's still in the early stages, sweetheart. Nothing concrete yet, just exploring possibilities." "At our engagement party," I said flatly. Catherine intervened, her tone deliberately light. "Natalie, business opportunities arise at the most unexpected moments. That's something you'll learn as you become more acquainted with Richard's world." I felt something snap inside me, a tether that had kept me bound to their expectations, their definitions of success and propriety, their assumptions about who I was and what I knew. "Actually, Catherine," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I'm quite familiar with how business opportunities work, more familiar than you might imagine." Richard squeezed my waist again, harder, this time. "Darling, let's not bore everyone with shop talk. Why don't we circulate? There are people I want you to meet." I stepped away from his grip, creating physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm widening between us. "I think I'll check on the catering first. Something seems to be amiss with the menu we originally planned." Without waiting for his response, I turned and walked toward the kitchen, aware of their eyes following me, but beyond caring about their judgment. For the first time that evening, I was acting on my own authority, rather than playing the role assigned to me. In the kitchen, I found chaos. Staff I didn't recognize were preparing dishes that weren't on our approved menu, while my regular team stood to the side, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Diego, the Meridian's head chef for 5 years and someone I considered a friend, looked relieved when he saw me. "Ms. Winters, thank God. This woman came in with Mr. Collins and started changing everything. She's insisting on serving these pretentious, deconstructed appetizers that take 3 times as long to prepare. We're falling behind schedule, and the quality is suffering." I surveyed the scene, noting the stressed staff and half-prepared food. This wasn't just an aesthetic issue. This was affecting people who depended on me for their livelihoods. "Where is she now?" I asked. Diego nodded toward a corner where a woman in designer clothes was berating a young server. "That's her. Brought her own sous chef, too. Says she's from some trendy catering company Veronica recommended." I approached them, catching the end of the woman's tirade. "Completely unacceptable. These plates need to be arranged exactly as..." I demonstrated. "The presentation is everything." The server, barely 20 and clearly fighting tears, nodded frantically. "Excuse me," I interrupted. "Is there a problem here?" The woman turned to me with obvious irritation. "And you are?" "I'm Natalie Winters. This is my engagement party." Her demeanor shifted instantly to saccharine politeness. "Oh, Mrs. Collins-to-be. I'm Sophia Reeves, executive chef at Avant-Garde Catering. Your fiancé and Ms. Sinclair brought me in to elevate the menu. Such a pleasure to meet you." "I wasn't aware that our catering arrangements needed elevation," I replied coolly. "Especially not mid-event." Sophia laughed nervously. "Well, when Mr. Collins explained the caliber of guests attending, we all agreed that the original menu was a bit provincial. Lux magazine has very discerning tastes, you know." I looked at the plates waiting to be served. Tiny portions of deconstructed food, artfully arranged but impractical for a standing reception. Food designed to impress rather than satisfy. Style over substance. It struck me as the perfect metaphor for what my relationship with Richard had become. "Diego," I called, "please revert to our original menu immediately." Sophia's eyes widened. "But Mr. Collins specifically approved." "Mr. Collins doesn't have the authority to make those decisions," I said firmly. "I do." The kitchen fell silent, staff pausing to watch the confrontation. Diego stepped forward, unable to hide his smile. "Right. Away, Ms. Winters. We can have the first course ready in 15 minutes. I turned back to Sophia. "Thank you for your time, but your services won't be needed tonight." But," she sputtered, "Ms. Sinclair assured me this would lead to a long-term contract with Lux Properties. Mr. Collins promised..." "Whatever Mr. Collins promised was not his to offer," I replied evenly. "And there is no Lux Properties. If you're referring to the hospitality group that owns this venue, it's called Winterscape Properties." Her face fell. "I've already turned down other events for tonight. My team has been preparing for hours." I felt a pang of sympathy for her, recognizing that she too had been manipulated by Richard and Veronica's machinations. "You'll be compensated for your time and ingredients," I assured her. "Please send the invoice directly to me." As Sophia gathered her things and left, I turned to face the kitchen staff. "I apologize for the confusion tonight," I said, addressing them as a group. "There have been some miscommunications. From this point forward, we're returning to the original plan. Any changes need to be approved by me personally." The staff nodded, relief evident on their faces as they returned to familiar routines. Diego approached me, keeping his voice low. "Should I inform Mr. Winters about all this?" he asked, referring to my grandfather's name that still formally headed company communications, part of the privacy arrangement I'd maintained. "No," I said after a moment's consideration. "I'll handle the explanations myself. It's time for some truths to come to light." As I left the kitchen, I felt lighter, more centered. This small assertion of authority, restoring order to one aspect of the evening, had broken through my paralysis. It wasn't enough to simply recognize the problem. I needed to act on that knowledge. The menu was just the beginning. One by one, I would reclaim the elements of my life that had been taken over or diminished, starting with this venue, this night, and most importantly, my own identity. As I re-entered the main hall, I caught sight of Richard and Veronica huddled in conversation with the photographer from Lux magazine. Their expressions were animated, ambitious. They were building something together, a narrative, a future, perhaps even a relationship, using my engagement party as their foundation. The anger I expected to feel didn't materialize. Instead, I experienced a curious detachment, as if I were observing characters in a play whose ending I already knew. Whatever happened next would be painful, public, and probably messy. But it would also be honest. Perhaps the first truly honest moment in my relationship with Richard. I squared my shoulders and moved toward them, ready to take the next step, into a future that was suddenly thrillingly uncertain. "What do you mean you've canceled the new menu?" Richard hissed, pulling me into a quiet alcove near the east terrace. His face was flushed, whether from champagne or anger I couldn't tell. Gordon Matthews was specifically looking forward to Sophia's signature dishes. I told him all about them. I met his gaze steadily. "The original menu was perfectly fine, Richard. There was no need to change it." "Fine?" It was basic, provincial. Hardly the caliber expected for an event of this stature. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing but now recognized as a tell for when he felt his control slipping. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked to get Matthews here? Do you know what this feature could mean for us?" "For us or for you?" I asked, echoing my earlier question. His expression hardened. "Don't start this again. Everything I do for our future." I glanced past him to where Veronica stood chatting with the photographer, her hand gestures animated, her smile calculated. "Including bringing your ex-girlfriend to redesign our engagement party without consulting me? Including starting a joint venture with her that you never bothered to mention?" "It's a business opportunity, Natalie. She has connections I need." He lowered his voice, leaning closer. "And your jealousy is showing. It's not attractive." The dismissal stung, but it also clarified something important. Richard wasn't just sidelining my preferences, he was actively discounting my feelings, making them seem petty and insignificant compared to his ambitions. "It's not jealousy to expect basic consideration," I replied evenly. "This is supposed to be our engagement party, yet you've made unilateral decisions about everything from the decor to the menu to the guest list. Because I know what works in these circles." His frustration was building, a vein pulsing at his temple. "I'm trying to elevate us, to position us advantageously. Why can't you see that?" The word elevate landed like a slap, the implication that I needed improvement, that I wasn't enough as I was. Before I could respond, Veronica approached, her smile tight with suspicion. "Is everything all right?" she asked, placing a proprietary hand on Richard's arm. "Gordon is asking about the menu change. He seems disappointed." Richard shot me a reproachful look. "Natalie made some last-minute adjustments without consulting." "Dear, without consulting you?" I repeated incredulously. "That's rich, considering—" "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Veronica interrupted, glancing meaningfully around at nearby guests who were beginning to notice our tense exchange. I smiled thinly. "You're right, Veronica. Some things should be handled privately, like relationship boundaries or basic respect." Her eyes narrowed, but her smile remained fixed. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," I replied, maintaining eye contact. "The question is whether Richard does." Richard stepped between us, his back partially to Veronica, as he addressed me in a low, urgent tone. "Enough. You're making a scene. We've worked too hard for this opportunity to have it derailed by whatever this is." "This," I said clearly, "is me drawing a line. The catering stays as originally planned, and I'd appreciate if you'd stop making decisions about our engagement party without me." Veronica laughed, the sound brittle with forced lightness. "Richard, darling, perhaps your fiancé doesn't understand the caliber of the opportunity we've arranged. Gordon Matthews doesn't feature just any event in Lux magazine." The casual darling wasn't lost on me, nor was the condescending tone. I turned to face her fully. "I understand perfectly well who Gordon Matthews is," I replied. "What I don't understand is why my fiancé's ex-girlfriend feels entitled to make decisions about my engagement party." Richard's face flushed deeper. "Natalie, that's enough. Veronica is here in a professional capacity. This is about business." "Is it?" I challenged. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like something else entirely." Veronica stepped closer, dropping all pretense of politeness. "Listen, I don't know what you think you saw, but Richard and I are colleagues, partners with a vision that extends beyond small thinking." Her gaze flicked dismissively over my dress, my jewelry, my entire being. "Perhaps if you supported his ambitions instead of hindering them, he wouldn't need to look the confrontation with Richard and Veronica." Left me feeling hollow yet strangely liberated. As they hurried off to placate the Lux magazine photographer, I escaped to the East Terrace, needing a moment alone to clear my head and formulate a plan. The cool evening air provided welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside. From this vantage point, I could see the city skyline stretched before me, a glittering constellation of lights against the darkening sky. 4 of those lights belonged to buildings in Winterscape's portfolio: the historic Montgomery Hotel with its rooftop garden, the recently renovated Archer Theater with its illuminated facade, the distinctive spire of the Westbrook Building, and the elegant glass-enclosed restaurant atop the Henderson. My grandfather had started with one crumbling theater and a dream. I had transformed that dream into an empire. Yet here I stood at my own engagement party, allowing my achievements to be diminished, my preferences overridden, and my identity compressed into the narrow role of supportive fiancé. Quite a view, isn't it? I turned to find Henry Walsh approaching, his silver hair catching the soft glow of the terrace lighting. As the senior partner of the city's most prestigious commercial real estate law firm, Henry had been my grandfather's attorney and now served as both my legal counsel and trusted mentor. "I didn't realize you'd arrived," I said, managing a genuine smile for the first time that evening. "I've been observing," Henry replied, joining me at the balustrade. "Professional?" "Habit." He studied my face. "I've watched you navigate billion-dollar acquisitions with less stress than this engagement party seems to be causing." I laughed softly. "That obvious, is it? To someone who knows you, yes." He nodded toward the main hall. "Your young man appears unaware of certain fundamental truths about his fiancée and about the venue he's so proudly showcasing to his colleagues. An oversight on my part," I admitted. "One I'm beginning to deeply regret." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "Transparency in partnerships is generally advisable, business or otherwise." "I've been telling myself I was waiting for the right moment," I said, turning to face him fully. "But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that if Richard knew the full extent of my success, it would change how he saw me. That I wouldn't be what he wanted anymore. And now? Now I'm wondering if what he wants is something I should aspire to be." Henry's expression softened with understanding. When your grandfather left you Winterscape, he told me he wasn't worried about the buildings. He was worried about you, that taking on such responsibility at a young age might prevent you from building a life beyond business, that you might sacrifice personal fulfillment for professional success. I absorbed this revelation, recognizing the irony. Instead, I've been sacrificing professional identity for a relationship that apparently can't accommodate the full scope of who I am. So what will you do? Henry asked, his question both simple and profound. I gazed back at the skyline, at the tangible evidence of what I'd built. Then I looked through the terrace doors at the engagement party unfolding without me, Richard and Veronica at its center, orchestrating their vision of success using my venue, my resources, my life as their stage. I think, I said slowly, it's time for some corporate restructuring. Henry raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. I assume we're speaking metaphorically. Not entirely. I straightened, mind suddenly clear with purpose. I need your help, Henry, and I need to speak with a few key people immediately. Consider me at your service, he replied, the formal phrase carrying the weight of decades of trust and collaboration. I outlined my plan quickly, efficiently. The same decisive leadership I brought to board meetings and acquisition negotiations, but had somehow left at the door of my personal life. Henry listened attentively, occasionally nodding or offering refinements to my strategy. It's bold, he said when I finished. But then you've never been one to think small. Your grandfather would approve. Will you make the necessary calls? I asked. I need everything in place within the hour. Consider it done. Henry pulled out his phone. And Natalie? For what it's worth, I think you're making the right decision. As Henry stepped away to make the arrangements, I turned back to the view, a sense of calm determination replacing the earlier turmoil. The path forward was clear now, illuminated by the simple recognition that I deserved a partner who celebrated rather than diminished my success. I allowed myself 5 minutes on the terrace, 5 minutes to acknowledge the grief of lost possibilities, the relief of shedding pretenses, and the exhilaration of reclaiming my power. Then I straightened my shoulders, touched my grandmother's sapphire earrings for courage, and returned to the party with renewed purpose. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. The first course of the original menu was being served, Diego's team working with practiced efficiency. Several guests approached to compliment the food, unaware of the earlier drama in the kitchen. I accepted their praise graciously, noting with satisfaction that Richard's attempt to elevate the offerings had been unnecessary. Across the room, I spotted Emma deep in conversation with Elise, my venue director. They both looked up as I approached, their expressions questioning. Everything's set, Emma reported quietly. Henry's making the final arrangements now. Good, I nodded. And the documentation? Elise handed me a slim leather portfolio. All the necessary papers as requested. The deed, the ownership certificates, the operating agreements, everything that confirms Winterscape's ownership of the Meridian and your ownership of Winterscape. Perfect, I said, tucking the portfolio under my arm. And the guest list. Verification? Complete, Emma confirmed. At least 15 people here tonight have direct business relationships with Winterscape properties, including 4 who sit on boards of companies where Richard is pitching for contracts. I absorbed this information, the pieces of my strategy falling into place. And Gordon Matthews? From Lux magazine? Emma's smile turned mischievous. Is actually here to cover the venue for their Historic Spaces feature next month. The interview was arranged weeks ago through Winterscape's PR team. He had no idea this was your engagement party until he arrived. A laugh escaped me, genuine and liberating. All evening, Richard had been performing for an audience that was already mine, leveraging connections that existed because of my business, not his. The irony was almost too perfect. "What about the projector setup?" I asked, moving on to the next phase of my plan. "Ready in the grand hall," Elise confirmed. "We can activate it whenever you give the signal." I glanced at my watch, noting that we had reached the midpoint of the evening, the moment traditionally reserved for toasts and formal acknowledgments. Richard would be expecting to take center stage, to leverage this moment for maximum professional benefit. He had no idea that the script was about to change dramatically. "One more thing," I said, looking between Emma and Elise. "After tonight, there will be significant changes to my personal situation. I want to assure you both that your positions at Winterscape are secure, regardless of any fallout." Emma squeezed my arm supportively. "We never doubted that, Nat. We're behind you." 100%. Elise nodded in agreement. "The entire staff is. Mr. Collins may have charmed some people tonight, but we all know who really built the Meridian into what it is." Their loyalty touched me deeply, reinforcing my conviction that the professional community I'd built was more authentic than the relationship I'd been struggling to preserve. "Thank you," I said simply. "Now, let's proceed with the plan. Emma, signal Henry when you see Richard move toward the stage for the toasts. Elise, make sure the catering team is ready with the champagne service according to the original schedule." As they moved off to execute their tasks, I took a moment to center myself. The next hour would transform my life irrevocably, bringing both public exposure and personal liberation. The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Across the room, I caught sight of Richard and Veronica, their heads bent, close together as they charmed a circle of influential guests. Richard's arm rested comfortably around Veronica's waist, a gesture too intimate for mere colleagues, too familiar for my engagement party. In that moment, any remaining doubt evaporated. My strategy wasn't about revenge or public humiliation. It was about truth, clearing away the fog of pretense to reveal the reality we had both been avoiding. Richard needed a partner who would orbit his ambitions. I needed one who could handle the gravity of mine. Taking a deep breath, I moved toward the center of the room, the leather portfolio secure under my arm and my mind clear with purpose. It was time to reclaim my venue, my engagement party, and most importantly, my authentic self. As I made my way through the crowd, Diego approached with a tray of champagne flutes. "The toast is scheduled for 10 minutes from now, Ms. Winters," he said quietly. "Everything is prepared according to your specifications." I selected a glass, noting the subtle W insignia etched into the crystal, another detail of my ownership that had gone unnoticed by Richard. "Thank you, Diego. And the special bottle for the head table?" "The 1982 Dom Perignon is chilled and ready," he confirmed. "Your grandfather's favorite." A wave of emotion passed through me at the mention of my grandfather. How strange that I'd spent 3 years with Richard yet never shared stories of the man who had shaped my life and business philosophy. Another piece of myself I had needlessly hidden away. "Perfect," I said, gathering my resolve. "Please proceed as planned." As Diego moved off, I felt a hand on my arm. Turning, I found myself face to face with Richard's father, William Collins, a distinguished man whose silver hair and tailored suits belied the humble beginnings he never let anyone forget. "Natalie," he greeted me, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Quite a gathering you and Richard have assembled, though I notice some unusual choices in the guest list." I smiled politely. "How so, William?" He gestured subtly toward a group of older gentlemen near the bar. "The Harrington brothers, for instance, old money real estate developers, notoriously difficult to access. And yet here they are at my son's engagement party." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Curious, considering Richard has been trying to secure a meeting with them for months without success." The Harringtons had been among my grandfather's closest friends and were now valued members of Winterscape's advisory board. Their presence tonight was a courtesy to me, not a networking opportunity for Richard. Perhaps the universe works in mysterious ways, I replied noncommittally. William studied me with new interest. Indeed, I'm beginning to think there's more to you than meets the eye, Natalie. Most people contain multitudes, William. Some are just better at hiding them than others. He chuckled, a sound of genuine amusement. Well said. You know, I always told Richard he needed a partner with depth, someone who could match his ambition with substance. He took a sip of his whiskey, eyes still appraising me over the rim of his glass. I'm starting to wonder if he found exactly that, but failed to recognize it. Before I could respond, Catherine appeared at her husband's side, her smile tight with social obligation. Natalie, darling, where has Richard disappeared to? It's almost time for the toasts. Her gaze swept the room, landing on her son and Veronica deep in conversation with the photographer from Lux magazine. Ah, there he is, still working the room, always the consummate professional. Indeed, I agreed mildly. He and Veronica seem to make quite the team. Catherine's eyes narrowed at my tone. They've always had a natural rapport. Professional chemistry is so important in business partnerships, don't you think? Chemistry certainly has its place, I conceded. Though in my experience, transparency and mutual respect are the true foundations of any successful partnership, business or otherwise. William coughed, poorly disguising a laugh. Catherine shot him a warning look before turning back to me. Speaking of business, Richard tells me your little consulting firm is doing well. How fulfilling for you. It must be nice to have a modest success of your own, especially knowing you'll have Richard's support when you eventually step back to focus on family. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, and it was a perfect distillation of how Richard and his family viewed me. A small-time business owner who would eventually surrender her modest ambitions to assume the more appropriate role of wife and mother, basking in the reflected glory of Richard's career. Actually, I replied, maintaining my composure, I have no intention of stepping back from my professional endeavors. If anything, I plan to expand them significantly in the coming years. Catherine's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. How modern. Though I wonder if that's entirely compatible with the lifestyle Richard envisions. An excellent question, I agreed. Perhaps one that should have been discussed more thoroughly before an engagement. William's eyebrows shot up at my candor, but before the conversation could continue, the gentle chime of a spoon against glass cut through the ambient noise of the party. All eyes turned toward the small stage at the front of the grand hall, where Richard now stood, champagne flute in hand, and Veronica hovering supportively nearby. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began, his voice carrying easily through the room. If I could have your attention for a moment, it's time for the traditional engagement toasts. Guests began to migrate toward the stage, arranging themselves to hear the speeches. Catherine placed a hand on my elbow, steering me forward. You should be up there with him, she said, her voice low. Whatever disagreement you two are having can wait until after the public appearances. I gently but firmly removed her hand. I'll join Richard momentarily. There's something I need to attend to first. Leaving Catherine staring after me, I made my way to where Emma and Henry were waiting near the audio-visual controls. Emma handed me a small remote. Everything is loaded and ready, she confirmed. One press of this button and the projector will activate. Henry offered me a supportive nod. Documents are prepared and witnesses are in place, should you need them. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Thank you both. No matter what happens next, I want you to know how much I appreciate your support. On stage, Richard was in his element, charming the crowd with practiced ease. When I proposed to Natalie 6 months ago, right here on the rooftop of the Meridian, I promised her the world. Tonight, as we celebrate our engagement surrounded by friends, family, and valued colleagues, I want to publicly renew that promise. A collective awe rippled through the audience. I noticed Gordon Matthews from Lux magazine scribbling notes, clearly captivated by Richard's performance. "The Meridian has special significance for us," Richard continued, gesturing grandly at the historic architecture surrounding us. "It represents the perfect blend of tradition and ambition, much like our relationship. Securing this venue for both the proposal and tonight's celebration required calling in every favor I've accumulated in my career, but Natalie is worth every effort." I felt a surge of indignation at his blatant misrepresentation. The venue had required no favors, no special arrangements, only a simple conversation with my management team. But Richard was constructing a narrative that positioned him as the powerful provider, the connected influencer who could open doors and create opportunities through sheer force of personality. It was the same narrative he had applied to our entire relationship, one where his success was central and mine was peripheral, where his contributions were significant and mine were supplementary. "I'd like to invite my beautiful fiancé to join me on stage," Richard announced, scanning the crowd for me. "Natalie, darling, where are you?" This was the moment. I could feel the weight of the remote in my hand, the leather portfolio tucked under my arm, the eyes of the crowd shifting to locate me. The strategy I had formulated with Henry and Emma was about to be put to the test. There would be no going back once I stepped forward. For a brief, vertiginous moment, doubt assailed me. Was I overreacting? Making too much of Richard's actions tonight? Creating unnecessary drama that would damage not just our relationship, but potentially my professional reputation? Then my gaze landed on Veronica, still hovering at the edge of the stage, her expression a mixture of triumph and anticipation, as she watched Richard command the room. In that moment, I knew with absolute clarity that proceeding with the engagement would mean surrendering more than my privacy. It would mean surrendering my identity, my autonomy, and my hard-won success. To maintain a relationship built on fundamental misunderstandings, I stepped forward, remote in one hand, portfolio in the other. "I'm here, Richard," I called, my voice steady despite the thundering of my heart. Relief washed over his face as he spotted me. "There you are. Come join me, darling. It's time to toast to our future." As I made my way toward the stage, the crowd parted before me, murmurs of approval following in my wake. I was acutely aware of Henry and Emma taking strategic positions near the room's exits, of Elise quietly directing the catering staff to prepare for the next phase, of Diego standing ready with a special bottle of champagne. I reached the 3 steps leading up to the stage and paused, suddenly aware that once I ascended, there would be no graceful retreat. The path I had chosen would unfold before the assembled crowd, changing irrevocably how they, and Richard, saw me. An unexpected memory surfaced. My grandfather on the day he handed me the keys to Winterscape's first office building. "Remember, Natalie," he'd said, his weathered hand covering mine. "It's not the buildings that matter in the end. It's whether you can stand tall in your own foundation." The memory steadied me. Whatever came next, I would face it as my true self, not the diminished version I had allowed Richard to believe in. I climbed the steps, accepting Richard's outstretched hand with a smile that felt strangely genuine despite everything. He drew me to his side, his arm circling my waist in a gesture that now felt more possessive than affectionate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "my fiancée, Natalie Winters, soon to be Natalie Collins." Applause filled the room. Cameras flashed. The moment stretched before me, a tipping point between the life I had been living and the one I deserved. Richard raised his glass. "Before I continue with my prepared remarks, I'd like to thank everyone who helped make tonight possible. The staff of the Meridian, who have been exceptionally accommodating." He nodded toward a cluster of servers near the back. "My creative director, Veronica Sinclair, whose exquisite taste elevated this event to magazine-worthy status. He gestured toward Veronica, who stepped forward with a self-satisfied smile. And of course, Gordon Matthews from Lux Magazine, who graciously agreed to feature our celebration in next month's issue. Each acknowledgement struck me as a subtle devaluation of my preferences in planning the party, of my taste in selecting the venue, of my worth as anything more than an accessory to Richard's carefully curated public image. "Richard," I interrupted gently, "may I add something before we continue?" He looked momentarily thrown by the deviation from script, but recovered with a camera-ready smile. "Of course, darling. The floor is yours." I turned to face the assembled guests, conscious of Richard's hand still firmly at my waist, of Veronica's narrowed gaze from the side of the stage, of the small remote concealed in my palm. "I'd like to begin by thanking you all for joining us tonight," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Your presence means a great deal to both of us. Many of you have known Richard for years through business connections, but fewer know me well." I paused, feeling the weight of truth waiting to be spoken. That's partly by design, as I've always valued privacy in my professional life. But tonight, I think it's time for proper introductions. Richard's grip on my waist tightened slightly. A warning, a question, or perhaps simple confusion at this departure from the expected script of supportive fiancé. "Richard mentioned the significance of the meridian in our relationship," I continued. "What he didn't mention, what he doesn't know, is that my connection to this venue runs far deeper than his." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Richard's smile remained fixed, but his eyes betrayed growing confusion. "Natalie?" he questioned softly, the uncertainty in his voice audible only to me. I pressed the button on the remote. Behind us, a large screen descended from the ceiling, and the projector illuminated with the Winterscape Properties logo, a stylized W against the silhouette of a historic building facade. Beneath it, in elegant script, appeared the words, "Natalie Winters, CEO and principal owner." The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. Richard's arm dropped from my waist as he turned to look at the screen, then back at me, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the first dawning of comprehension. "For those unfamiliar with Winterscape Properties," I continued, my voice unwavering, "it's the commercial real estate development company that owns and operates the Meridian, along with 17 other historic properties throughout the city." I turned to face Richard directly. "There were no favors called in to book this venue, Richard. No strings pulled. The reason we were able to have both your proposal and our engagement party here is quite simple. I own it." A hush fell over the room as the implications of my words sank in. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, calculating, reassessing, connecting dots that had previously seemed unrelated. Richard's business contacts now recognized me as a major player in the very industry where he sought to advance. His friends saw the power dynamic of our relationship shifting before their eyes. And Richard himself stood frozen, the foundations of his understanding crumbling beneath him. "I don't understand," he finally managed, his voice oddly vulnerable in the silence. "Winterscape is my company," I confirmed gently. "Inherited from my grandfather 5 years ago and expanded significantly under my leadership since then." Veronica had edged closer, her calculating gaze darting between the projected logo, Richard's stunned face, and me. I could almost see her reassessing my value, no longer merely the supportive fiancé to be tolerated, but a potential business connection to be cultivated. "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard asked, his voice low but carrying in the hushed room. "All this time, you let me believe that I was a small business owner who admired your ambition?" I completed his thought. "Yes, I did. At first because it didn't seem relevant. We were just dating. Later, because I noticed something troubling. Whenever I demonstrated too much business acumen or suggested too ambitious an idea, You became uncomfortable, distant. Richard flushed, aware of the audience witnessing this revelation. That's not true. I've always supported your career. My cute little consulting business? I quoted his words back to him. The one you assumed I'd eventually set aside when it was time to focus on being Mrs. Richard Collins? A few uncomfortable laughs sounded from the audience. Catherine stood rigid with mortification, while William watched the scene unfold with unexpected interest. You deliberately deceived me, Richard countered, trying to shift blame. You pretended to be someone you're not. I never lied about who I am, I corrected him calmly. I simply didn't volunteer information you never asked for. You assumed I wasn't particularly successful or ambitious because that narrative fit your expectations better than the truth. Richard's gaze darted to the assembled crowd, clearly gauging the damage to his carefully cultivated image. His jaw tightened as he realized he was losing control of the narrative, and of me. Why now? He demanded, frustration edging his voice. Why reveal this in front of everyone? To humiliate me publicly? I shook my head. That was never my intention. I planned to tell you privately after the party, but then I arrived to find you, and Veronica had redesigned everything without consulting me, making decisions about my property as if my preferences were irrelevant. Veronica stepped forward then, her professional mask barely concealing the calculation beneath. If what you're saying is true, Natalie, then we should absolutely discuss potential collaborations. Your resources combined with our marketing expertise could be synergistic. Her naked opportunism, pivoting from romantic rival to business networker in the space of seconds, was breathtaking in its transparency. Richard looked at her with dawning comprehension, seeing perhaps for the first time the ambitious operator beneath the supportive colleague persona. I turned to face Veronica directly. I appreciate your entrepreneurial spirit, but I'm afraid Winterscape already has an exceptional marketing team. In fact, they're the ones who arranged the Lux magazine feature on the Meridian 3 months ago, completely independent of tonight's engagement party. Gordon Matthews stepped forward from the crowd, looking uncomfortable. That's correct. I was originally commissioned to photograph the architectural features for the Historic Spaces series. The engagement party was a surprise addition to my assignment. I watched the realization dawn on Richard's face. The magazine feature. He had been leveraging all evening. The opportunity he had used to justify overriding my preferences had been secured months ago through Winterscape's existing relationship with the publication. All around us, the carefully constructed facade of Richard as powerful connector, as indispensable facilitator of opportunities, was crumbling. And in its place, a new reality was emerging. Natalie Winters, CEO of Winterscape Properties, stepping fully into the light. Richard's expression hardened as he struggled to regain control of the situation. If you'll excuse us, he said to the crowd, his tone forcibly light. It seems my fiancé and I need to have a private conversation. He reached for my arm, but I held my ground. Actually, Richard, I think we've had enough private conversations built on partial truths. If you have something to say to me, you can say it right here. His eyes flashed with anger, not just at the challenge to his authority, but at the public nature of that challenge. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, he was seeing the real me, not the accommodating, supportive partner he had expected, but a woman who had built an empire of her own, who had succeeded in the very industry where he sought to make his mark. And judging by the tightening of his jaw, the revelation was not a welcome one. Fine, he said, voice tight with suppressed emotion. You want public? Then let's be public. How about explaining to our guests why you felt the need to maintain this elaborate deception? Why you couldn't trust the man you agreed to marry with the truth about your business? The question hung in the air between us, a gauntlet thrown down, a test of my resolve and my willingness to confront the most uncomfortable truth of all. my own complicity in the charade our relationship had become. Richard's question hung in the air, challenging and accusatory. Our guests had gone completely silent, watching the drama unfold with a mixture of discomfort and fascination. For a heartbeat, I considered deflecting, making some gentle excuse that would save face for both of us and allow us to continue this conversation in private. But that impulse to smooth things over, to protect Richard's ego at the expense of my truth, was precisely what had led us to this moment. It was time to break the pattern. "That's a fair question," I acknowledged, my voice calm despite the tension crackling between us. "The truth is, I started noticing early in our relationship that you seemed most comfortable when you were the more accomplished partner. When I offered business insights that matched or exceeded yours, you would dismiss them or change the subject. You'd explain basic concepts I'd mastered years ago, interrupting me if I demonstrated too much knowledge." Richard's face flushed. "That's ridiculous. I've always respected your intelligence." "My intelligence, yes," I agreed, "but not my ambition or my success. Those made you uneasy. So I began downplaying them, telling myself I was being considerate of your feelings, that the right moment to share the full extent of my business would come eventually. But that moment never seemed to arrive, because the deeper we got into our relationship, the more I realized that you needed me to be less so, you could feel like more." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I could see recognition in some of the women's faces, an uncomfortable familiarity with the dynamic I was describing. "That's absurd," Richard protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're making me sound like some insecure chauvinist." "I'm not trying to demonize you, Richard. I'm answering your question honestly, and taking responsibility for my part in this as well. I chose to hide pieces of myself instead of demanding a relationship where I could be fully seen and valued." Veronica, ever the opportunist, attempted to intervene. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. I'm sure the guests can make their own decisions about whether to stay or go," I interrupted firmly. "But this is my venue, and I'm finished hiding who I am within its walls." My directness seemed to stun her into momentary silence. Richard, however, was regrouping, his expression shifting from defensive to calculating. "Your venue," he repeated, emphasizing the words. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Ownership, control. You've been planning this ambush, all along." I shook my head. "This wasn't planned, Richard. If it had been, I would have prepared better remarks." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the audience. What was planned was a private conversation after the party, where I would finally share the truth about Winterscape. But when I arrived tonight to find you and your ex-girlfriend had completely redesigned our engagement party without consulting me, using my venue as a backdrop for your networking ambitions, something shifted. "Veronica is here in a professional capacity," Richard insisted, though his eyes darted briefly to her and away again. "She has connections that could benefit both of us." "Both of us?" I echoed. "Or just you? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like the only person benefiting from her presence tonight is you." The tension between us had drawn the crowd closer, their hushed whispers creating a soundtrack to our confrontation. I was vaguely aware of cameras being discreetly raised, of Gordon Matthews furiously taking notes in the corner. "You're being paranoid," Richard said, lowering his voice, "and creating a scene that's embarrassing both of us." "No, Richard. I'm finally being honest. And yes, it's uncomfortable, for both of us. But I'm done pretending to be less than I am to make you feel more secure." An unexpected voice cut through the tension. "If I might interject," Henry Walsh said, stepping forward from the crowd. "As legal counsel for Winterscape Properties, and Ms. Winters personally, I feel compelled to clarify some points that may be relevant to tonight's my discussions." All eyes turned to Henry, his distinguished presence commanding immediate attention. Richard's expression shifted from angry to wary at the introduction of a legal perspective. The revelation of Ms. Winter's ownership of this venue and her position as CEO of Winterscape is, of course, significant, Henry continued. But there's another aspect that may be of interest. He nodded toward Emma, who tapped at her tablet. The screen behind us changed, displaying a document with Lux Magazine's letterhead. This is a contract signed 3 months ago between Winterscape Properties and Lux Magazine, Henry explained. It outlines a 6-part feature series on historic venues in the city, beginning with the Meridian. Gordon Matthews stepped forward, looking slightly uncomfortable. That's correct. The engagement party was a surprise addition to my assignment. I was originally commissioned to photograph the architectural features of the Meridian for our Historic Spaces series. Richard's complexion had gone from flushed to ashen. You mean the magazine feature? The one I've been leveraging all evening? Was already in place? Because of Natalie? Precisely, Henry confirmed. Furthermore, several of the business connections Mr. Collins has been cultivating tonight are, in fact, long-standing associates of Winterscape Properties. The Harrington brothers, for instance, served on the advisory board with Ms. Winter's grandfather and continue that relationship with her. The Harrington brothers, 2 distinguished gentlemen in their 70s, raised their glasses in my direction from across the room, their expressions a mixture of amusement and respect. Richard turned to me, genuine bewilderment replacing anger. Is this true? The Harringtons are here because of you? I've been trying to secure a meeting with them for months. Yes, I confirmed simply. Though I didn't invite them to create this situation. They're here because they're friends as well. As business associates. I could see Richard reassessing everything. The venue, the guest list, the connections he'd been so proudly showcasing. The realization that much of what he'd attributed to his own influence had, in fact, been facilitated by my position all along. In this suspended moment, as disappointment and humiliation warred on Richard's face, something unexpected happened. William Collins stepped forward, extending his hand to me. Ms. Winters, he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. It seems proper introductions are long overdue. William Collins, CEO of Collins Development. I'd be very interested in discussing potential collaborations between our firms, on a strictly professional basis, of course, given the evolving circumstances. His intervention was masterful, acknowledging the personal drama unfolding while simultaneously offering a professional lifeline that shifted focus from scandal to opportunity. It was the kind of strategic pivot I would have made myself in a difficult negotiation. I accepted his handshake, recognizing both the olive branch and the business acumen behind it. I'd welcome that conversation, Mr. Collins. Perhaps next week, once the dust has settled. Catherine looked horrified at her husband's pragmatic approach, but several other guests, sensing that alignment with me might be more advantageous than loyalty to Richard in this moment, began moving closer, business cards appearing discreetly. I was witnessing a real-time recalibration of the room's power dynamics. What had begun as a potential public humiliation was transforming into something entirely different. A coming-out party for Natalie Winters, CEO of Winterscape Properties. Not as Richard's accessory or supportive partner, but as a power player in her own right. The Harrington brothers approached next, bypassing Richard entirely to speak with me. Franklin would be proud, the elder Harrington said, referring to my grandfather. You've maintained his vision while expanding it in ways he could only have dreamed. We'd love to hear your plans for the Henderson property when you have time. Thank you, Thomas. I'd value your perspective on that project, I replied, feeling a surge of pride at being publicly acknowledged as my grandfather's true successor. One by one, the very connections Richard had been desperately cultivating all evening gravitated toward me, drawn not by borrowed prestige but by authentic influence. Business cards were exchanged, potential meetings discussed, professional respect offered without qualification or condescension. I caught sight of Richard and Veronica engaged in a heated, whispered exchange at the edge of the stage. Her expression was accusing, his defensive. Their professional partnership was fracturing under the weight of revealed truths. Gordon Matthews approached me, recorder in hand. "Ms. Winters, if I might have a word? It seems the focus of our Lux magazine feature may need adjustment in light of tonight's revelations." I smiled, appreciating the irony. "I'd be happy to discuss that, Mr. Matthews. Perhaps we should consider a piece on women in commercial real estate. There are quite a few remarkable stories beyond my own." As Matthews nodded enthusiastically, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Diego stood there, the special bottle of champagne in hand. "The 1982 Dom Perignon, Ms. Winters," he said. "Still chilled and ready to be served. Shall I proceed with the toast as planned?" I glanced at Richard, still huddled with Veronica, then at the gathering of business leaders and influencers now clustered around me. The engagement celebration had transformed into something else entirely, not an ending, but a beginning. A public declaration not of marital intentions, but of professional identity. Yes, I decided, accepting the bottle, but with a slight change of focus. As Diego moved to distribute fresh champagne flutes, I returned to the center of the stage. The crowd quieted, attention shifting back to me. Emma appeared at my side, whispering, "This wasn't part of the plan, but I think it's brilliant. Go get 'em, boss." I smiled, appreciating her support as I prepared to address the room. Initially, I had envisioned this moment as a necessary, but difficult confrontation, setting the record straight before stepping away from a relationship built on false pretenses. Instead, it had evolved into an unexpected opportunity to claim my place in both professional and personal spheres on my own terms. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "I'd like to propose a toast, not the one I anticipated making earlier this evening, but perhaps a more honest one." The room fell silent as Diego finished distributing champagne flutes. Even Richard had turned to watch, his expression guarded. "Tonight has been revelatory in ways I hadn't planned," I continued. "What began as an engagement celebration has become something else, a moment of truth that, while uncomfortable, was perhaps long overdue." I raised my glass. "So I'd like to toast to authenticity, to removing the masks we sometimes wear, even with those closest to us, to valuing ourselves enough to demand relationships, both personal and professional, that honor our full capabilities rather than diminish them." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Several of the women present raised their glasses, with particular emphasis, their expressions reflecting recognition of the struggle I had articulated. "I'd also like to toast to the Meridian itself," I continued, gesturing to the historic architecture surrounding us. "My grandfather purchased this building when it was slated for demolition. Everyone told him he was crazy, that it couldn't be restored, that the investment would never pay off. But he saw beyond the crumbling facade to the beauty underneath." I paused, feeling a swell of emotion. "He taught me that some things, buildings, businesses, and yes, people, are worth investing in, worth restoring to their full potential. But he also taught me that we shouldn't have to diminish our light to be worthy of love or respect." My gaze found Richard's across the room. His expression had softened slightly, a complexity of emotions playing across his features. Anger still, but also confusion, loss, and perhaps a dawning recognition of what he had failed to see. "Finally," I said, "I'd like to toast to new beginnings. Because sometimes the endings we fear most turn out to be doorways to possibilities we couldn't have imagined." I raised my glass higher. "To authenticity, restoration, and new beginnings." "To authenticity, restoration, and new beginnings," the crowd echoed, glasses raised. As the toast concluded, the atmosphere in the room shifted again, the intense drama giving way to a more relaxed, celebratory mood. The string quartet resumed playing, conversation flowed more naturally, and guests began to circulate again, though with noticeably different patterns than before. I found myself surrounded by a circle of engaged listeners, business associates and new acquaintances eager to hear more about Winterscape's projects and vision. For the first time that evening, I spoke freely about my work, my ambitions, my successes, without filtering or diminishing them. It was exhilarating, not just to be acknowledged professionally, but to integrate that core part of my identity into my social interactions without apology or constraint. From across the room, I caught sight of Richard watching me, his expression unreadable. Veronica had disappeared, perhaps sensing that her strategic value in this new landscape had diminished considerably. Catherine was engaged in damage control with her social circle, while William conversed animatedly with Henry Walsh, seemingly unbothered by the evening's dramatic turn. Emma sidled up to me during a brief lull in conversations. "So, not exactly how we planned for this to go," she observed, handing me a fresh glass of champagne. "Not exactly," I agreed. "But sometimes the best strategies emerge in the moment." "And Richard?" she asked quietly. "What happens now?" I glanced toward him, noting that he had moved to a quieter corner of the hall, nursing a drink alone. Despite everything, I felt a pang of empathy. The foundation of our relationship had been false, yes, but my complicity in that falsehood was undeniable. "I don't know," I admitted. "That conversation still needs to happen, just not in the way I originally imagined." Emma nodded, understanding. "Whatever you decide, you know you've got a whole team behind you." "I know," I said, squeezing her arm gratefully. "And that's worth more than any engagement." As Emma moved away to coordinate with the catering staff, I found myself in a moment of unexpected stillness amidst the flowing party. The weight of the portfolio containing Winterscape's documentation, the tangible proof of my professional accomplishments, felt different now, lighter somehow. The secret I had carried for so long, the division between my personal and professional selves, had dissolved. Whatever came next with Richard, confrontation, conversation, closure, I would face it as my complete, integrated self. The woman who had built Winterscape, the woman who had restored the Meridian, the woman who had, finally, restored herself. The engagement party continued around me, transformed from the networking event Richard had engineered into something more authentic, a celebration not of an impending marriage but of truth unveiled. For over an hour, I moved through conversations that would have been unimaginable earlier in the evening, discussing potential investments with the Harrington brothers, arranging a proper interview with Gordon Matthews for the Lux magazine feature, and accepting business cards from people who now saw me as Natalie Winters, CEO, rather than simply Richard's fiancé. All the while, I was acutely aware of Richard watching from the periphery. He had remained at the party, nursing the same drink for the past hour, his expression alternating between anger, confusion, and calculation. Veronica had reappeared briefly to collect her things before departing with a tight smile and promises to touch base soon, a retreat that spoke volumes about the conditional nature of her interest in Richard. As the evening began winding down, with many guests having already made their farewells, I knew the confrontation I had been postponing was inevitable. Richard and I needed to speak privately, not to salvage what was clearly unsalvageable, but to achieve some kind of closure that acknowledged the truth of our situation. I asked Emma to begin the process of seeing guests out, then made my way toward Richard. He straightened as I approached, his shoulders squaring as if preparing for battle. "Quite a performance," he said, his tone suspended between bitterness and grudging admiration. "You certainly know how to command a room when you want to." "It wasn't a performance, Richard. It was the truth, finally." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "The truth. Interesting concept coming from someone who spent 3 years pretending to be something she's not. I never pretended, I countered, keeping my voice level despite the accusation. I simply didn't correct your assumptions. Same difference. No, it's not. I gestured toward a pair of doors leading to a private sitting room off the main hall. Can we continue this conversation somewhere more private? I think we both deserve that much. He hesitated, his pride visibly warring with curiosity. Finally, he nodded and followed me into the sitting room, a beautifully appointed space with comfortable seating and a small fireplace that cast a warm glow over the antique furnishings. I closed the doors behind us, grateful for the sudden hush, after hours of party noise. Richard remained standing, declining the seat I offered with a short shake of his head. So, he began, breaking the silence, Winterscape Properties. That's quite a secret to keep from the man you agreed to marry. It is, I acknowledged. And I've been questioning that decision increasingly over the past few months. Questioning, but not actually doing anything about it. His tone was accusatory. Not until it was too late. Too late? I repeated. You mean tonight, Richard? I was planning to tell you after the party. I decided it was finally time. And I'm supposed to believe that? He paced toward the fireplace, his reflection fractured in the antique mirror above it. After 3 years of deception? Yes, I said simply. Because despite everything, I've never outright lied to you. Not once. He turned to face me, incredulity written across his features. You allowed me to believe you ran a small consulting firm. You let me pitch business ideas to people who already knew you, who probably laughed about it behind my back. You watched me try to impress contacts you already had. How is that not lying? His words stung because they contained a kernel of truth. I had allowed a false impression to persist, had watched him operate under misconceptions I could have corrected. You're right, I conceded, meeting his gaze directly. I should have been honest from the beginning. The longer I waited, the harder it became to broach the subject. That's on me, and I'm sorry for it. My apology seemed to catch him off guard. He'd clearly been prepared for defensiveness, not accountability. But Richard, I continued, you need to ask yourself why I felt I couldn't share this part of myself with you. Why I believed, with increasing evidence, that my success would threaten rather than delight you. That's ridiculous, he protested, though with less conviction than before. I would have been proud of your accomplishments. Would you? I challenged gently. Each time I demonstrated too much business knowledge or ambition, you became distant. You dismissed my insights, interrupted me when I spoke on topics you considered your domain. You explained basic concepts I'd mastered years ago as if I were a beginner. He opened his mouth to object, then closed it again, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Think about tonight, I pressed. When you discovered who I really was, your first reaction wasn't pride or even surprise. It was anger. Not because I'd kept it from you, but because the revelation disrupted your perception of our roles. You as the ambitious provider, me as the supportive partner who would eventually set aside her cute little business to focus on family. Richard ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen countless times. You're twisting things, making me sound like some controlling chauvinist. I'm not trying to demonize you, I said, softening my tone. I'm trying to help you understand why this happened, why we both allowed a relationship to develop on a foundation that couldn't possibly support it. The fire crackled in the grate, filling the silence that stretched between us. Outside, I could hear the muted sounds of the party continuing to wind down. Voices saying goodbyes, the faint strains of the string quartet playing their final pieces. And Veronica? I asked finally. Was she just a business connection too? Richard's expression tightened. For a moment, I thought he might deny it. offer some elaborate explanation that maintained the fiction of a purely professional relationship. Instead, he sighed, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "It wasn't planned," he said quietly. "We dated briefly before I met you, as you know. Working together brought old feelings back to the surface. Nothing physical happened, but there were lines crossed. Emotional lines." His admission hung in the air between us, not the bombshell it might have been hours earlier, but a confirmation of suspicions I'd been reluctant to acknowledge. "Thank you for being honest," I said, surprised by how little pain the confirmation brought. Perhaps I had already begun disentangling my heart from his, even before tonight's revelations. "It doesn't matter now anyway," Richard continued, bitterness edging his voice. "You should have seen how quickly she pivoted when she realized who you really are. Suddenly, all her interest was in Winterscape, not me." Despite everything, I felt a flicker of sympathy for him. That can't have felt good. "It was illuminating," he admitted, "though not as illuminating as watching my father practically offer you a business partnership while our engagement imploded. Always the pragmatist, William." "He's a businessman first," I observed. "Something we have in common, apparently." Richard laughed, a sound with more genuine humor than I'd expected. "God, that's true. You two would probably get along terrifyingly." "Well," he sobered, regarding me with newfound curiosity, "you really built Winterscape into what it is today? From what my father said, it's one of the most successful commercial real estate companies in the region." "I did," I confirmed. "My grandfather left me a solid foundation, but we've tripled our portfolio in the past 5 years. The Meridian was actually our first major restoration project under my leadership. And I proposed to you here without having any idea." He shook his head, a rueful smile playing at his lips. "Called in favors that didn't exist. For a venue you already owned. That must have been quite a moment for you." "It was," I admitted. "I almost told you then, but it didn't seem like the right time." "Was there ever going to be a right time, Natalie? Really?" It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly over the past months. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I keep telling myself there would be, but with each passing day, I found more evidence that our relationship worked best when I diminished parts of myself. That's not sustainable or healthy for anyone." Richard was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its defensive edge. "I don't think I'm the villain you're making me out to be, but I'm not the hero of this story either." "There are no villains here," I said quietly. "Just two people who wanted different things than they were willing to admit, even to themselves." He turned to face me fully, his expression softer than it had been all evening. "What happens now?" I slipped the engagement ring from my finger, the diamond catching the firelight as I held it out to him. "I think we both know." He didn't take the ring immediately, his gaze lingering on it with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. 3 years, he said softly. "Not all of it was a lie, was it?" "No," I assured him. "There were real feelings, real moments, but not a real foundation." He nodded, finally accepting the ring. Our fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, a last physical connection marking the end of a relationship that had consumed 3 years of our lives. "I am sorry," I said, meaning it. "Not for who I am or what I've built, but for not being brave enough to show you those parts of myself sooner. We both deserved better than a relationship built on half-truths." "I'm sorry too," he replied, surprising me with his candor. "For making you feel like you needed to be less to be loved. That was never my conscious intention, but intentions don't always align with actions, do they?" "No," I agreed. "They don't." A knock at the door interrupted our moment of mutual acknowledgement. Emma poked her head in, her expression apologetic. "Sorry to interrupt, but the last guests are leaving. The Harringtons wanted to say goodbye to you personally." "Thank you. Emma, I'll be right there." As Emma withdrew, Richard pocketed the ring and straightened his tie. Small gestures of composure before facing the world again. "I should go. My parents left about 20 minutes ago. Apparently, my mother needed her smelling salts." I couldn't help but smile at the image. Catherine never did approve of me. Imagine her horror if she'd known I was actually a CEO all along. "She would have been insufferable," Richard agreed, returning my smile briefly before sobering. "For what it's worth, I think my father was right about one thing. You're going to be a force in this city. I'm sorry I won't be there to see it. Or at least, not from the vantage point I'd imagined." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched by the acknowledgement. "And Richard? Despite everything, I hope you find what you're looking for, with someone who fits the role better than I ever could." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Goodbye, Natalie." "Goodbye, Richard." As he left the sitting room, closing the door quietly behind him, I remained by the fireplace, absorbing the finality of the moment. 3 years of my life had just concluded in a 10-minute conversation, a relationship that had shaped my daily existence, influenced my decisions, and ultimately taught me painful but necessary lessons about authenticity and self-worth. I felt a complex mixture of emotions: sadness for what might have been had we both been different people, relief at no longer maintaining the exhausting division between my personal and professional selves, and most surprisingly, excitement for the uncharted future stretching before me. The woman who had entered the Meridian hours earlier, anxious about her fiancé's reaction to her true identity, willing to accept less than she deserved to maintain a flawed relationship, had disappeared as completely as the cream silk dress I'd carefully chosen to meet Richard's expectations. In her place stood someone both familiar and new: Natalie Winters without qualifiers or diminishments, CEO of Winterscape Properties, owner of the Meridian. A woman who no longer needed to hide her light to make others comfortable with its brightness. I took a deep breath, feeling my grandmother's sapphire earrings brush against my neck, a touchstone connecting me to generations of strong women who had faced their own moments of reckoning and emerged transformed. Then I straightened my shoulders and opened the door, ready to say my farewells to the final guests of what had become not an engagement party, but a coming-out celebration, a public declaration of self that felt more significant than any proposal could have been. The Harrington brothers were waiting in the main hall, their distinguished faces creased with genuine warmth as I approached. "There she is," Thomas Harrington said, extending his hand. "Franklin's granddaughter, finally stepping into the light. He would have been proud beyond words, my dear." "Thank you," I replied, touched by the connection to my grandfather. "That means more than you know." "We meant what we said earlier," his brother Howard added. "About discussing the Henderson project. That property has enormous potential with the right vision behind it." "I'd value your perspective," I said sincerely. "Perhaps we could meet next week?" As we confirmed details and said our goodbyes, I was struck by the ease with which I now moved through these professional interactions. No more filtering or downplaying, no more careful management of how much expertise to reveal. The liberation was intoxicating. Emma returned to my side as the Harringtons departed, leaving us alone in the grand hall. "Well," she said, surveying the now empty space, "that was quite possibly the most dramatic engagement party in the history of the Meridian. And considering this building dates back to 1897, that's saying something." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. Not exactly what I had planned when I woke up this morning. "The best strategic pivots rarely are," she observed with a smile. "So, boss, what happens now?" I gazed around the Meridian, at the soaring ceilings and elegant architecture I had fought to preserve, at the space that had witnessed not just the birth and death of my engagement, but the rebirth of my authentic self. "Now," I said, certainty blooming within me, "we build something new, something true." And for the first time in years, I felt the foundation beneath me was solid enough to support whatever I chose to create next. 6 months passed, like pages turning in a well-crafted novel, each day bringing new developments, challenges, and unexpected joys as I navigated life after Richard. The night of the engagement party had marked not an ending, but a beginning, a threshold crossed into a life where I no longer compartmentalized myself into separate personas. The morning after the party, I had awakened in my apartment feeling strangely weightless, as if I'd shed an invisible burden I hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. My first act had been to call Henry Walsh to discuss setting up a foundation in my grandfather's name, focusing on architectural preservation and community development, a project I had long contemplated but had hesitated to pursue while with Richard, knowing it would raise questions about my financial capacity that I wasn't prepared to answer. That single decision, made freely, without calculation of how it might affect someone else's perception of me, set the tone for everything that followed. Professionally, Winterscape Properties flourished. The Lux magazine feature on the Meridian evolved into a comprehensive profile of the company's preservation philosophy, bringing new attention to our work. The Henderson project that I had discussed with the Harrington brothers became our most ambitious undertaking yet, transforming a neglected Art Deco department store into a mixed-use development that combined luxury residential units with affordable artist spaces and community amenities. More significantly, I stopped hiding my role as CEO. I accepted speaking engagements I would have previously declined, participated openly in industry events, and allowed my name to be associated with Winterscape's successes in press releases and media coverage. The silent owner became a vocal advocate for thoughtful urban development and historic preservation. Personally, the transformation was equally profound. I reconnected with friends I had inadvertently distanced during my relationship with Richard, particularly female friends whose ambition and success had seemed threatening to the careful balance I had been maintaining. Weekend brunches became strategy sessions, hikes turned into brainstorming opportunities, and vacations evolved into investment reconnaissance missions with women who understood the exhilaration of building something meaningful. My apartment underwent a metamorphosis as well. I finally decorated it according to my own aesthetic preferences rather than anticipating Richard's tastes. The muted, tasteful decor that had felt like a compromise gave way to bold colors, eclectic art pieces I had collected during travels, and architectural salvage elements from Winterscape restoration projects, creating a space that told my story, authentically. Of course, there were moments of doubt and regret, nights when I questioned whether I had acted too rashly, whether Richard and I might have found a way forward had I approached the revelation differently. Days when I missed the simple comfort of sharing my life with someone who knew my daily rhythms, even if he hadn't known my true professional identity. But those moments grew fewer and farther between as I settled into the freedom of authenticity. The energy I had once expended maintaining separate versions of myself was now channeled into creative ventures, meaningful friendships, and professional innovations that excited me. I heard about Richard occasionally through mutual connections. He had left his marketing position at the hospitality group, accepting a more senior role with a competitor in a different city. The move was positioned as a promotion, though industry whispers suggested it was at least partly motivated by a desire to escape the shadow of what had happened at our engagement party. Veronica had not accompanied him in this transition, their professional partnership apparently having reached its natural conclusion. I wished him well, genuinely. Our relationship, for all its flaws, had been the catalyst for my own awakening. Without the pressure of maintaining the charade, without the constant recalibration of how much of myself Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.